Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I'm super excited for the discussion that we're going to be having today around bipolar. And I do have a special guest that's here with us, which I will introduce shortly. I do have Dr. Alicia Porter. Dr. Alicia Porter is a specialist psychiatrist and is a child and adolescent psychiatrist and the clinical head of the Child and Family Unit at Charlotte Maxeke, Johannesburg Academic Hospital. She is a joint appointee and lectures in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Witwatersrand. She completed her undergraduate training at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in 2002 and her specialist training at the College of Medicine of SA, as well as the Royal College of Psychiatrists in 2010. Dr. Porter has a diploma in human rights, mental health, and law from the Indian Law College in Pune, India, which she obtained in 2019. Her special interests are child and adolescent mental health, women's mental health in the workplace, which is what we're going to be discussing today, and burnout. She is a mental health advocate and believes in mental health promotion and primary prevention. Dr. Alicia, welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Lebohang. It's lovely to be back here. I was just saying to you earlier, it's been a while, but it's good to be home.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Alicia. I think it's amazing to have you join us today. Obviously, the topic is probably different from last year's discussion, but today we will be covering bipolar in the workplace. And I think, it's such an amazing topic that I'd like for us to unpack today so that we can just have the discussion so that all our viewers have a better understanding of, bipolar, especially within the workplace. So maybe just to hear from you, Dr. Alicia, what are the different types of bipolar disorder and how do the symptoms look in a professional setting?
I think this is a very important topic. I think just generally, mental health concerns have definitely increased, or there's been an increased awareness within workspaces, but there's still so much stigma that, exists. And it's how do we separate, a person's condition from the person and also from their workplace. And so in terms of your bipolar mood disorder, there are, from an academic point of view, there are about five or six types, but for our purposes, the main forms of bipolar that we see is bipolar 1, bipolar 2, and something that we call cyclothymia. So bipolar 1 and 2, the thing that the conditions have in common is the fact that there is a major depressive, there are major depressive episodes. And bipolar 1, you have major depressive episodes plus manic episodes. And by manic episodes, we mean a severe mood dysregulation, which can then be accompanied by increase in talkativeness, increase in energy levels, decreased need for sleep, increase in productivity. And then you have your depressive episode, which would look like either an irritable mood or a depressed mood. It also then comes with decreased energy levels, decreased motivation, apathy, almost like what I often think of as like a leaden paralysis where you are unable to even get up out of bed. Your bipolar 2, you still have a major depressive episode, but there is what we call a hypomanic, which is a less severe form of your manic episode. And the thing about a hypomanic episode is that it can go or it can be missed because in your hypomanic episode, it may sort of be just a slight change from normal. And in the workplace, there may be increased productivity, a little bit more talkativeness, a little bit more socializing, but that's not what causes the functional impairment. It is the major depressive disorder. And then your cyclothymia is sort of a very milder form where there are depressive episodes, there's hypomanic episodes, and these are not enough to meet, a full criteria for an episode, but these are sort of, they go on for a persistent amount of time. And so, the one thing that I maybe need to say with regards to a bipolar mood disorder, I think that, movies and the media and platforms have really done a disservice in how a bipolar, the bipolar condition is depicted, and the thing is that, people who suffer with a bipolar disorder spend more time, actually sometimes more than 50% of episodes are actually major depressive episodes and not the manic and the hypomanic episodes that, Hollywood has made a lot of money depicting. And so, in the workspace, the mania may look like increased productivity. It may look like, very risky decision making. It may look like impulsivity. But the depression, on the other hand, may look like, high absenteeism, decrease in productivity, fatigue, some sort of impairment in, thinking and decision making. So it is important to translate, because I often like to think of it that, an individual cannot switch off who they are. They can't switch off their problems. They can't switch off, if they have a condition when they get into the workspace and then be expected, to perform. But I will say that people who suffer with the bipolar mood disorder are probably one of the more functional, individuals in terms of being able to function and achieve, regardless of, the diagnoses.
Sure, Dr. Porter. I think I really appreciate what you said there, because at times when you have a conversation with someone, they will refer back to like a movie that they watched or series that they watched, and like, wow, this person has bipolar disorder. But what we are seeing in movies is completely different to what we are seeing in individuals and what they're going through. And I love what you said, that when someone goes into a workplace, they can't just switch off who they are. They can't just now forget about the person that they are, and that, as they come in, we need to obviously accept them for who they are. And I love what you said there in terms of them being more active, and function quite a lot in a workplace, and they achieve quite a lot. And I think we will touch on that a bit later. But thank you so much for clarifying that, and also giving a lot more, explanation around the different types of bipolar disorder, so that when we do engage with someone who might have, for example, bipolar disorder 1, we at least know what it is that we need to look out for within a workplace setting. Maybe just to ask you, Dr. Porter, how do the highs, so like your mania/hypomania, and lows, so like depression of bipolar disorder, impact work performance, and relationships? I know you touched on it a bit in your previous explanation, but how do these impact the work performance, but also together with the relationships?
And I also think it's important to sort of start out by saying that if, it doesn't mean because you have a bipolar mood disorder that you're going to be dysfunctional. You are not the dysfunction of the disorder. So if your bipolar is well controlled, then there is no functional impairment, and you're able to then perform. Because we often get sort of calls or referrals from companies where, a employee has disclosed that they have bipolar, but they are highly functional, but there's the stress because, I often think, like, if a person disclosed that they have diabetes, would the reaction be the same? And, so, bipolar mood disorder does not equal dysfunction, but the dysfunction comes in when there are episodes. So, and it would be different depending on the episode. So like I mentioned just now, in the manic or the hypomanic, the hypomanic episode is tricky because oftentimes that is when, an individual is productive in the workplace, they're getting things done, they're meeting their targets, and then, so it seems like it's okay, and that's why it's missed. Whereas the dysfunction with your bipolar 2 comes more in the depressive episode, where just it's a struggle to get out of bed. There's no motivation, poor attention and concentration, and just a difficulty to be able to carry out usual day-to-day tasks. Whereas again, with your bipolar 1, the impairment would come in both the manic and the depressive phase. So the depressive phase would be the same as described earlier, but with your manic phase, that is the individual who may have increase in impulsivity. They may have risk-taking, behaviors, but they also may have these bursts of productivity, but not necessarily goal-directed, productivity, or there may be hyper-focus or an enthusiasm that may then be, more impulsive, and it can also lead to conflict with colleagues, and also difficulty just following, the workplace norms. And the conflict, again, because, your manic episode is not just a elevated mood. There's also irritability, it also may present as irritability, which can then lead to more conflict with colleagues, poor interpersonal relationships, or just poor judgment, and poor decision making.
Yeah. What you just said right now, Dr. Porter, is that it can come up in two different ways, right? In the sense of, with the work performance, there is a lot of, you want to function, you can function, you can achieve quite a lot, but then again, with the relationships, there might be a level of irritability, like you mentioned, and then a bit of conflict there. And, I can only imagine from somebody else's perspective, and someone who does not have this knowledge that we're about to share, today, that we're sharing with you today, it's a bit difficult to know where they're at, because especially if the person presents with like your mania or hypomania a lot more, in the office versus the lows every now and then, it can be a bit difficult to know where the balance is, or, how to look out for that. And, I just want to maybe ask this question in the sense of, are some work environments more challenging for individuals with bipolar disorder? Are work environments different, where there will be more challenges that one faces versus other work environments? What are your thoughts around
There
that?
definitely will be workspaces or workplaces that are more challenging in terms of being able to manage the bipolar mood disorder. And so, with a bipolar mood disorder, routine is very important. And so workspaces where there's shift work, for example, would become difficult to navigate. Also workplaces where there's high stress. But I think we could argue that every workspace is stressful, but there are environments where they are more stressful than others. So, the financial sector, emergency services, those are high stress environments, and it becomes difficult because stress is it's part of the job description. Also, jobs that require long hours or even night shift, that becomes difficult to manage, and also jobs where you're going to be in different time zones, that would also be difficult. So a exec who has a job in Dubai but the offices are in New York, that becomes difficult because sleep and that routine and that rhythm is very important. And so it would just become that more difficult to navigate. So it is about thinking, just like when your kids are going to school, is this school a good fit for my kid? Is this job a good fit? Because you have to consider, the condition when making a decision, which sadly often is not the case, because obviously our sort of employment climate or landscape is quite difficult. But in order to manage or, navigate the disorder, it is important to factor these things, like what is going to be a good fit for me.
Sure, and I like what you said there, that with a lot of the work environments, there is stress, and we obviously can't just neglect that and say, well, some workplaces are not as stressful as others. But with those work environments, obviously with the type of stress, sometimes it can be very overwhelming, and it can also maybe add on, to how one is feeling on that particular day. And if it's quite demanding, it can also be very overwhelming. And what you said there is you need to then re-look at the workplace, and if it's the right fit for you, as someone who is having difficulties with bipolar disorder, and having to see what might be helpful, in terms of the work environment, because sometimes the work environments can be very stressful. And we're obviously not saying that work environments are not stressful, but there are those that are a bit stressful, more stressful than others. And maybe just to, get some more insight, there are a lot of myths or stigmas around bipolar disorder in general, and I think in the society that we live in and in the country that we live in, there is that lack of knowledge around bipolar disorder, how it is like, and that, there are times where one would experience their highs, like mania and hypomania, and lows like depression, like you mentioned. What are some of those common myths about bipolar disorder in the workplace environment? What are some of those common myths that people come across in the workplace?
I mean, I think it's movies like The Silver Linings Playbook that definitely would illustrate. It'd be a good exercise to kind of look at all the myths that are contained therein. But I think one of the, the bigger myths or the more common myths is that, a bipolar mood, just anyone who has mood swings is bipolar. So every adolescent in South Africa is bipolar. Do I have bipolar because I have mood swings? No, you don't. But also bipolar is not just mood swings. Bipolar also impacts somebody's cognition, so the ability to think and make decisions. It also then impacts behavior and also energy levels. It's not just about mood, or somebody who has mood swings. It doesn't mean you're bipolar. Like, we can also we can also react to things if we're happy or sad. So it's those fluctuations, but it also comes with other things. So if it impacts your social functioning, or if it impacts your work, then we can, say, now you have a disorder. But we have to be careful, when we start labeling, just labeling because of one symptom. It's more than that. The other myth in the workplace is that people who suffer with bipolar are unreliable and incapable of maintaining employment. I mean, if the condition is successfully managed, and there's treatment and support, there's no reason why somebody who has or is suffering with the bipolar mood disorder cannot be highly functional. And so, you see that more and more in the workspaces where there's this sort of move to, if you, and I get the difficulty even in people who suffer actually disclosing, because there's this idea that, I've been working with you all along. Suddenly I tell you I have bipolar mood disorder, and suddenly I'm deemed not to be able to function, which is really quite, I think that's a myth. And also this idea that, employees who have bipolar are always in crisis. The fact is that there can be long periods of stability. And the crisis comes in those periods where there are relapses. So, employees are not their bipolar. They are their level of productivity and creativity that they bring to a team. I mean, I think it's just anecdotal, but I mean, I often think to myself, maybe we all need a little bit of bipolar, the bipolar gene in order to be creative. So I think we really need to separate, like we do with diabetics or hypertensives. We never say, oh gosh, no, you can't be here.
Sure. What you just mentioned now, Dr. Alicia, is something that I actually had to sit with for a while, as you were explaining it. Some people might be so uncomfortable to disclose that they have or they're experiencing challenges, for example, with bipolar mood disorder, because of the myths that are attached to bipolar disorder. And once one discloses that, there is obviously then that stigma that says, yeah, maybe you're not the right fit. And I think it's quite discouraging for people to then have those open relationships with people or their colleagues, or their managers, within the workplace, because of the stigmas that are attached to bipolar mood disorder. And I think we need to create that safe, environment, that safe space for, all our colleagues, our employees, our employers, who may be struggling with any mental health condition like bipolar mood disorder, because then we're saying, there's absolutely nothing wrong with you. It is a challenge that you're experiencing, but it doesn't say anything different about the type of person that you are. And I think it's very important that we start creating, that environment. And the next question that I'm going to ask you touches on that a bit, to say, how can stigma affect an employee's willingness, to disclose their condition or to even look for support, especially within a workplace environment?
I mean, stigma is real. And I don't think that we should just, it's just stigma. So, the workspaces just need to get on with it. Stigma it's a real challenge. It's a challenge. And I think the biggest sort of driver is, a lot of the time employers fear what they don't know. So it's that fear of the unknown, or fear of how it's been depicted, and all of these myths. And so, you hear it and then suddenly, so I do think that, people in the workspace who have these struggles, I think it is a real, and it doesn't matter how much the laws and the policies say, I think it is a challenge, because there is a fear of being discriminated. So every mistake you then make is going to be, it's your bipolar. No, I'm not my bipolar. It is a condition, so that fear of discrimination, even just fear of losing losing employment, or even just being perceived as incompetent because you have a disorder. Not that, you kind of brought it on yourself. We can't outrun our genes. And so I think it really is. And I often, when I have clients who are in the workspace and, kind of processing having to disclose to an employer, because you're going to need leave, or the workload is, you're going to need to be accommodated. Oftentimes there's this sort of disconnect between the workplace's understanding of it and kind of like, so it's like, okay, if somebody needs, say, for example, just 2 weeks of sick leave, suddenly there's a request, no, you need to put them on temporary disability. No, they are not temporary disabled. They just need 2 weeks of leave. So, so it's often this high conflict with, the employee in the middle. And, often I've had some horrible things said, over the telephone about how, every time this employee comes to see you, they get ideas. No, they don't get ideas. It's like, how do we manage it? It's here to stay we need to begin to appreciate or understand how we're going to navigate it rather than just sort of sidelining or no, you must go on. I'm like, but you don't qualify for, you are not temporary disabled. You just need 2 weeks of sick leave.
Sure. And sometimes people tend to look down on what difference that would make, in one's how they come across, their performance, they also their confidence, and it's so sad that there's a stigma that's attached, and it makes it so difficult for people to actually say, listen, I'm really having a hard time. Because then it's attached as, oh yeah, because you couldn't complete this task, oh yeah, because of your bipolar, like what you said, Dr. Alicia. And I think it's our then duty or responsibility to break that stigma, especially within a workplace environment, so that it's a safer environment where people can actually talk about what their challenges are, and also what kind of support they seek. Maybe just to ask a bit more around the legal side of things, right? What legal protections exist for employees with bipolar disorder? Should it be that one comes across, challenges within their workplace? What are some of those legal protections that are available for employees with bipolar disorder?
I mean, there are legal protections that exist, even, in the South African context. So, the Employees Equity Act, where it protects individuals from being unfairly discriminated. But the difficulty is that, as an employee, do you know the contents of the Employers Equity Act? Do you know your rights? And I find that, it's the lack of agency, because you just believe whatever you're told without actually knowing it for yourself. So, I think it would be imperative, if you do have a disability, for example, or you classified as a person, you should know the laws that are protective of you. Also, the Labor Relations Act is another one that prevents dismissal on the basis of a bipolar, of any mental condition. So it talks about, medical conditions, and a bipolar mood disorder is a medical condition. Whether we believe it or not, it is. It's in the textbook. There's a whole science about it, And then also the Occupational Health and Safety Act, where it requires that employers actually have reasonable accommodations, within the workspace. But I just find that there's a lack of awareness or knowing that there are these laws or policies or legislation that actually protects one. And so, because there's such a, the power dynamic is so lopsided, oftentimes employees feel very disenfranchised. They feel like, if I don't comply or I don't sign this document, it's my job on the line. So, it is difficult, but I think it starts with knowing what legislation could protect, and you speak in those terms rather than, my practitioner said.
Yeah, I think, there's this saying that says knowledge is power. And I agree with you on that, to say, we need to obviously learn more about what legal protections are there, for us as employees with bipolar disorder. So that we are then empowered with this knowledge, and we can actually stand up for ourselves. And if there is that unfair dismissal because of, bipolar mood disorder, then at least we can speak up for ourselves. I see we are running out of time. However, I do need to ask this last question. We've been talking a lot about the workspace, and I think I just want to, I want everyone who works within a workspace to get some steps and tips. Dr. Alicia, what are some of those steps that workplaces can take to foster a more inclusive and understanding environment for employees with bipolar disorder? And how can then people within the workplace be more educated about bipolar disorder to better support those who are affected with a bipolar disorder?
I mean, I definitely think, in order to break particularly stigma, we're going to need to start with education and training. Like you said, Leohan, knowledge is power. And oftentimes, if we know, then we are equipped. And so I think, just being able to educate, staff on mental health would actually help to reduce stigma, because you are educating, you're training, you're bringing awareness. Because I think the first step starts with awareness. And I often say these are not things that require high capex and high budget. Essentially, it's just let's start the conversations in the workspace. Also just looking at the mental health policies, like we have policies for everything, and standard operating procedures for everything. Why not have, mental health policies where it shows, or you actually document the support structures and what accommodations are and what accommodations could be afforded within the workspace. And also just open communication. How do we make workspaces safe spaces? I mean, I know, you don't go to work to make friends and to get validation, but just having a supportive culture, and just non-judgmental dialogue may be then important. And that's what the workspace, can do. And even just encouraging peer support structures within the workspace. So in my mind, it's a culture shift in terms of kind of making mental health an event. Like, it's been, you don't hear anything about bipolar until it's Bipolar Awareness Month, and then it's everything about until next year, but how do we begin to change the cultures within our workspaces to be more inclusive? And yes, no, we're not expecting the workplace to treat the disorder. That's where the medical fraternity, and the allied health professionals come in. But I mean, I think it's about having a holistic, supportive view and also collaborating. And often, we are on the same team because it's often the employee in the middle. There's the employer, and then there's the practitioners. Contrary to what may be, we are on the same team because it should be the well-being of the employee that we have top of mind. And so how do we begin to collaborate? But we first have to get around and have a conversation, or else, we will be on opposing ends.
Yeah. I think starting the conversations is so important, because then that's how we'll then start to learn more, start to engage more. And there is also that level of inclusivity, where we want to learn, we want to involve, one another a lot more. And I think it's very helpful that we are having such discussions with yourselves as experts, Dr. Alicia, where you give us more knowledge, and you also empower those who are experiencing challenges with bipolar disorder on how to actually speak up for themselves, and also creating more awareness around those who are working in a workspace or work environment where there are people who are experiencing challenges, and how to best support and assist them. Dr. Alicia, thank you so much for this amazing discussion. I was making notes on my notebook, and I think I've learned quite a lot. Your discussion, I think 30 minutes is not enough, but thank you so much for
It
all
never
your
is.
input. It never is. But thank you, Dr. Alicia.
Thank you so much for having me, Lebogang.
Thank you. Thank you. And thanks to all our viewers for joining us today. Please do have yourselves a great day, and we will see you next time. Bye, everyone.